All right. The executive branch of the federal bureaucracy, Chapter 8. So the federal bureaucracy are going to be all the departments and agencies and so forth that work within the executive branch that help to carry out and to enforce all the policy of the government. Okay? So it makes the executive branch by far the largest. We're talking about a couple million people working in the bureaucracy, right? Federal employees, and that doesn't include the military. Okay? So let's talk about the growth of the system. A lot of it starts with the Civil War. Okay, we get the Department of Agriculture, which is largely going to be developed because of a food shortage during the Civil War. So Lincoln's going to instill this. We get the pension office that's set up after the war to make sure that veterans are paid their pension for their service in the military. You get the Department of Justice that's largely going to be set up to help with the Reconstruction issues in the South. Okay, so we're seeing at this time, the exponential growth, right, of the federal bureaucracy with thousands and thousands of new jobs, as opposed to early on, right, where you had President Washington, who only had 4 cabinet positions, with Secretary of State, Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of Treasury, lest we forget Alexander Hamilton. Okay. At first, these jobs that are going to be handed out to work on all these policies are going to be based on patronage, and patronage simply means that you're rewarding people for what they've done. It's a spoils system. Andrew Jackson really kind of popularized this. It leads to a lot of corruption in government, and actually people that aren't really qualified to hold some of the positions that they have. They're just being rewarded for what they've done. Then we move towards a merit system, right, which is largely established by the Pendleton Act, that people are going to be hired based on their qualifications for the job. Okay. Today we have a civil service system, okay, where people actually are given a rank. They have to take a test, and some 90% of the people that work for the federal government are part of this system, meaning that they are not appointed by the President of the United States, but they are hired, and they work. That's their job, and they work in that department or for that agency or whatever it is. As an employee, regardless of who's president. They may have gotten their job under President Bush, and they're still holding that job, okay? Much like, I got hired here working in Marysville under Superintendent Zimmerman. I still have a job, even though we have a new superintendent, right? And it's the same thing with most of the federal employees. They're not appointed by the President of the United States. That's the job that they've been hired to do, okay? There's a statue of Jackson in this whole patronage system. To the victors go the spoils system. Okay. All right. Some excuse me. After the Civil War, we're going to get some agencies designed to help regulate commerce, right? With the Interstate Commerce Commission. We're going to get the Federal Trade Commission, and we're also going to see the split of commerce and labor. It becomes painfully obvious that you probably can't have the same department in the government, but one that supports the owners of business, which would be commerce, and one that supports the labor, which are the workers. Okay, so they're going to be split up into two different departments, which makes sense. Okay. And this is just going to be largely a reflection of the expansion of our economy, okay, with the need for these commissions to help Congress regulate and oversee what's going on, okay? We're going to get the 16th Amendment. Hopefully we can remember that one, right? At 16, you become very expensive, just like a tax, okay? And we get a federal income tax. This is going to allow the government to really grow, because it's going to have another source of income, right? And so we're going to see the greater growth of the federal government, since it's going to have more money to be able to spend, okay, on different policies and projects, okay? So if we see here, right, and this is in the thousands, okay, 1945 was really kind of the peak. So you're talking, over 3.5 million, right? Today, we're down here, right around 2.5 million people that work in the federal executive department, okay? Again, This does not include active military personnel. All right. The wars and growth of the government, obviously we're going to see with the stock market crash in 1929 and the Depression, we're going to see President Roosevelt respond with a number of different programs and agencies to help regulate business and to help impact the economy, all right, through a lot of government work programs, through Social Security, so on and so forth, okay? We're going to see the GI Bill, which is going to be there. If you join the military, when you come back, we'll have a job for you, or we'll help put you in school and give you an education, all right, so we get, like the Veterans Administration, okay, to benefit those that have served their country, all right? Lyndon Johnson is going to be another time when the government greatly expands. Sometimes it's called the Second New Deal, or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Okay, this is going to be time of kind of the civil rights movement too, right? So this time we have the Civil Rights Act being passed. We have the Fair Housing Act being passed. And what are you going to have to create to really kind of help enforce those laws, right? So you're going to have the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You're going to have the Department of Transportation. That's going to try to improve the infrastructure, okay? You're also going to have during this time more programs created to fight poverty. So you're also going to get programs like Medicaid, right, which is going to be health care for the poor, okay? That is also going to grow during Johnson's time. And many believe that Johnson would have been a much more successful president if we wouldn't have been fighting the Vietnam War, and more effort could have been put on some of these other programs instead of all the money that was being spent on the war in Vietnam. There's sometimes a criticism of why Johnson's Great Society was not as successful as it could have been. Okay. Okay. So let's look at the organization of the bureaucracy, okay? Because we have different parts of it. The first one, the one that we're maybe most familiar with, are the cabinet departments, all right, which are laid out here, okay? See, how many do we have of them? Let's count them, right? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There's one that you all love right there, the Department of Education. Here are the 4 original ones, right? The Department of Defense has changed its name from the Department of War. Doesn't sound quite as bad, right? They're all secretaries of, right? The secretaries of are in charge of all of these departments, and the secretaries of are all appointed by the president with the approval of who? I know you all said it. Okay. The Department of Justice, though, is the only one that's not secretary of. The person that's the head of the Department of Justice is the Attorney General, whoever said it. Okay. So those are the departments that oversee programs and public policy related to their individual areas, and each one of these departments have different agencies within them that are more specific, right? The Department of Justice has the FBI, for example. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Government corporations. Let's talk about those real quick. So government corporations actually are supposed to be self-sufficient, right? They provide a service or a product for the public, okay, and charge a fee, okay? However, a lot of the government corporations still have to be kind of backed up by tax dollars because they're not always self-sufficient, right? So you think of Amtrak, Tennessee Valley Authority, and maybe the biggest one as a government corporation is the United States Post Office. Okay? All right, now, when can government workers be involved in political activity? Okay? So you need to know this act, and it's on in more detail in one of the handouts that I have in the folder, but the Hatch Act is going to limit the political activity that employees in the federal government can engage in, okay? About how they can become directly involved in a political campaign. So there have been some amendments to it. A lot of people believed it was too harsh. and limited people's, right to participate in the government just because they work for the government, that they couldn't actually be involved in campaigns. So some of the amendments to the Hatch Act are you can run for an office, but it has to be a nonpartisan election. So nonpartisan elections could be, I don't know, school board a lot of times is a nonpartisan election, okay? If you work for the federal government, you can still give to political organizations. That doesn't bar you from that. And you can campaign for candidates. However, you can't campaign for candidates while you're on duty, okay? You couldn't make phone calls, from your job. Related to that, right, is let's say that we're having a campaign for a levy in Marysville. I'm limited in what I can do here at school, right? I'm not allowed to make calls from my desk, right, to try to encourage people to vote for the school levy, or I'm not allowed to wear pro-levy shirts to school, okay, and so forth. Now, once I leave school, right, from another phone, I can make calls, or I can go out and put out campaign signs and do those things, right? It just limits what you can do. Same thing like with the President of the United States, right? The President of the United States isn't allowed to make campaign calls for money from the Oval Office. Now, he has a private residency in the White House because that's where he lives. He can do it there. But in the office space, as part of his job as president, he's limited by things that are included with the Hatch Act as well, okay? All right, so who are bureaucrats, right? People that work for the bureaucracy. And a bureaucracy is just simply a way to organize something, right? It's hierarchical, like a pyramid, okay? Like I said before, most of them are part of the civil service system. Their jobs are filled by a competitive exam or ranking, an interview. They have to be qualified, okay? Now, there are about 10%, like this chart says here, what the slide says, that are not part of the civil service system, okay? That they are appointed by the president, right? And they have to be approved by who? Okay? And then we have some independent regulatory commissions and some low-level non-policy patronage positions, which might be like secretarial type help, okay, that aren't necessarily part of the civil service system. Your independent regulatory commissions aren't actually appointed by the president, okay? We'll get into that. All right, so these people hold their jobs for life, basically, or until they're fired or they get another job, okay, whatever it might be. But however, in the key positions, when we're talking about like the heads of these departments or the assistant heads of these departments, there's a high turnover in these different departments because largely we get turnovers in administrations, right? We get new presidents, okay? We get new leadership that are going to put different people into these key presidential appointees. But the civil service part of it, the 90 other percent, continue to work, for that agency. That's, I know that President Trump has had a lot of issues early on, certainly with the Department of Justice. Well, the people that he says he's having a problem with there, the people that are part of this civil service system, they're the bureaucrats. They're the people that were appointed under President Obama or got their job under President Obama and still have their job. And he felt like they were, undermining his presidency because they happened to get their job when President Obama was in office, okay? Even though they weren't an appointee, the belief that, hey, they favored that administration and now they have something against my administration, okay? The key is with, bureaucrats, this whole idea of decentralization is that we're going to spread out the responsibility of different areas of policy, whatever it deals with, whether it's agriculture, education, defense, transportation, housing, whatever. We're going to decentralize that out into different areas where people that are specialized to oversee, develop policy, so on and so forth, instead of a centralized group of people making decisions in all areas. It helps to decentralize, policy areas. However, it also really has grown the federal government to where it's become, immense, right? So here we go. Federal employees. These GS markings here. This is basically their rank. Okay. So GS 1 through 4. This is how much money you would make, right? the GS 13 through 15, this is how much money you would make, right? And we can see quite a discrepancy. Let's see here. This is talking about total percentage of federal workers who are. Okay, so females are purple, okay, males, okay, that are at these different levels. So we see here with males, with the top two positions, GS 9 through 15, we start to see a larger increase in the number of male employees who are federal workers as opposed to the bottom positions. Okay, we have federal agencies located all over the, the United States. Here's your different regions. We're in Region 5, it looks like, right? And so it doesn't mean if you work for the federal government that you work in Washington, D.C., right? For example, there are Social Security offices all over the country, right? There are Veterans Administration offices all over the country, okay, that help administer policy that may be developed in Washington, D.C., but then they oversee it in these different areas of the country, okay? All right, iron triangles. We've talked about this before, okay? So an iron triangle, you have a bureaucratic agency, all right? Let's say that we have, I don't know, the FDA, right? The Food and Drug Administration, okay? Then you have a congressional agency that oversees the FDA and helps maybe decide how much money the FDA gets. And then you get an interest group, pharmaceutical companies and lobbyists that benefit from policies developed by the FDA or may be hurt by policies developed by the FDA. That creates an iron triangle where they are they're reliant on each other and there's a mutual benefit for each other, right? You have lobbyists, large corporations that can form political action committees that can give monies to members of Congress for their campaigns, who then in turn can help pass policies and give authority to an agency like the FDA, who then can pass policies and make things easier on pharmaceutical companies, right? This is an iron triangle. These are not as common, okay? There's a lot of criticism of these. The biggest criticism came about because of what was known as the military-industrial complex, which was you had a bureaucratic agency, okay, like the Department of Defense. You had a congressional committee, Committee on Armed Services, and then you had people that made military weapons, okay? And the theory was, right, what's the best way to need military weapons? Well, you engage in war and conflict, all right? And so why did we keep things like Korea and Vietnam going? There's thought, well, it has something to do with this military-industrial complex because it was mutually beneficial economically to do that. And obviously that's a bad thing to do when we're talking about war as the reason you're keeping things going to make profit. Okay, so iron triangles have largely died out, though they're still referred to this on the exam. What's more common now is going to be issue networks. Come back here. So an issue network is similar to an iron triangle, meaning that there's going to be bureaucratic agencies, interest groups, corporations, and congressional committees involved. However, there's numerous bureaucratic agencies involved, there's numerous committees involved, there's numerous interest groups involved, okay? There's a lot more actors involved in issue networks, okay? And they come together to solve a particular issue, okay? However, once the issue is solved, that issue network kind of goes away. So let's say we have an issue like, protecting an endangered species in an area where they want to do logging, okay? Like there's an owl, but they want to log this area. There are a lot of different groups that are involved in that issue, okay? And not all those people involved in that issue agree with each other, but they're forced to work together to try to come up with some solution where they can still log that area, but then protect, the endangered species, okay? So issue networks are not the people involved in issue networks or the groups involved in issue networks are not so reliant on each other. They have conflicting issues, and once the issue is dealt with, it goes away. It's not permanent, okay? And people can have conflicting sides of the issue, right? but they have to come up with some type of solution to the problem. Okay, so that's why they have to come together. Okay. Let's see here. All right, moving on. Okay, so making policy. Okay, one of the big complaints about some of the different agencies and departments is that they have kind of this quasi-legislative process, right? Meaning that, you know, the FDA or the FFA or whatever can make rules and regulations that businesses, people in the United States, whoever, have to follow, and they can administer fines and punishment if they're not followed. Well, how is that done? Okay. Well, Congress basically authorizes these different departments and agencies to have authority to make these, right? Because Congress can't make every single specific law or act, say, to regulate the environment. Okay, so you have experts in the the EPA, that's a regulatory agency, to pass standards of gas emissions or water quality. Okay. And Congress gives them the authority in order to make those regulations and then to enforce them. Okay? So here's kind of how it's made, right? You get a new rule that's going to be drafted, right? It's going to be a new standard for the air. The Office of Management and Budget is going to review and see whether or not it's cost effective. If it's cost effective, it moves on. Okay? Down the line, right? And it can to get the final regulation published, okay, and then passed on. The Office of Management and Budget is going to review the final version, and then it goes to the Federal Register, and now it's an ordinance. It can be disapproved at these different stops, okay. And these are the people that are involved, right? You can have new legislation passed by Congress. An executive branch can make a decision in an executive order. They can order these people to draft something. An interest group can try to pressure a department or agency to do something. There could be media pressure. Okay, lots of things can create pressure in order for the department or an agency to draft new rules or regulations. Okay. All right. So the executive's control, okay, over the bureaucracy. Okay. It can be difficult for the executive, the president, to control because there's so much of a delegation of power. Because it's so decentralized and so many different people have authority, it can be difficult for the executive to control it. Okay. However, he can try to reorganize the bureaucracy, like try to create different departments or maybe break up a department into two different departments or whatever. However, Congress has to approve that. Okay. One of maybe the biggest ways that the executive can control is through executive orders, right, where he gives directions to different agencies that have the force of law, which we talked about, whether it's executive order to the Department of Homeland Security dealing with a travel ban. Okay, obviously the other way that the executive can control is through the appointment powers, appointing the heads of these agencies and the higher up in these different departments with the approval of who. Okay, is another way that the executive can control the bureaucracy. Congressional control. Obviously, we know that the Senate can confirm or reject appointment by the president. They have oversight power. We've talked about this with police patrols or fire alarms. They can investigate and oversee what happens in the different bureaucratic agencies. Okay, and then lastly, they have the power of the purse. They're the ones that authorize the budget. They're the ones that authorize spending. And so they can cut spending to the Department of Defense. They can cut spending to the Department of Education. Okay? So Congress can have a lot of control within the checks and balance system over what all these different departments and agencies do. Okay? Judicial control. Okay? The courts can issue injunctions, right, which basically can stop a particular rule or regulation from going into effect, okay? And it can be done even before it's publicized, okay? If somebody says, no, this this particular rule or ordinance that's going to try to be passed by or enforced by this department creates this or violates the law here, the courts can issue an injunction. Okay, they can enforce due process, right? Meaning this, that let's say that Howard Stern got fined all the time by the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, but he still had due process rights. If he would wanted to challenge the fact that the FCC was going to fine him for saying some words or doing something on the radio, he had due process, right? There was a process that he was allowed to go through to challenge that decision. And if he's not given the opportunity to do that, then his due process rights have been violated. Much like if somebody charges you with a crime, you have due process rights, right, to take you through the system. You have a right to challenge the charges and present your own evidence and so forth, right? They just can't say, nope, you did this, here's the fine, okay? You have a right to challenge that, all right? And then there's always the threat of litigation, okay? People can challenge through the courts, right? This rule or ordinance or whatever that's been enforced by this department or agency violates my rights, and we are going to sue. And then the courts can decide that, right? So that does happen when you file suits against different agencies, okay? Either it's a violation of their rights, or maybe the interpretation is incorrect, okay? Or maybe the law is not being enforced properly, okay? So you can say, hey, we're challenging this in court, and then the courts can make a decision whether or not it was done properly, okay? Remember, the job of the courts is to interpret the law, and this really is kind of considered to be law, okay? Let's see here. All right, how are agencies made? President has authority to appoint and remove agency's head, okay? He can reorganize the bureaucracy. He can make changes in their budget proposals, okay? Congress passing legislation that changes what bureaucracies can do. They can abolish programs. They can refuse to give money. They can investigate, okay? This is a good chart to know about how the three branches can impact the different government agencies and bureaucracy. All right, I'm going to go back here. There's a slide that I should have spent a little bit more time on, because all we really talked about were the different departments. And so I want to go back and talk about the other, let's see here, where are we at? Tahachak, ba-boom, ba-boom, right here. Okay, so we went over the cabinet departments, the independent executive agencies, okay? So independent executive agencies would be, they're not part of a department, okay? They're independent of a department, and they have a much narrower focus, okay? So the Environmental Protection Agency, okay, would be a good example of an independent executive agency. Independent regulatory commissions that are not a part of the cabinet departments, okay? They're also not under the direct responsibility of the president. They're not appointed by the presidents. They have a very specific mission or policy. For example, regulating nuclear power, right? We have a nuclear regulatory commission, okay? That's not something you necessarily want under the direct control of the president, okay? So, and then we get other things like NASA, right? Where does NASA fit? They're really an independent executive agency, okay? They don't fit under the Department of Defense, Department of Transportation maybe, I don't know. The CIA, right? They're not part of a cabinet department. Where do you put them? Do you put our spy agency in the Department of Defense? You put them in the Department of State, right? Some things that just don't fit well under any of these departments are placed under the independent executive agencies, okay? And then we already went over government corporations, okay? There's a sheet in your folder that has some of the main government agencies that you need to know. But when you think of the bureaucracy, here's what I want you to remember, okay? I want you to remember the FDA, the EPA, the Federal Trade Commission. Let's see here, what else? FCC, as examples of what the bureaucracy is and the types of regulations, right, that they can enforce. Okay? All right, that's it. I know that was confusing, but again, it's just a summary. There's a lot more that we'll go over, and we'll deal with this individually to see exactly how policy is made when we get into the past the judicial branch, and some of this stuff will become a lot more clear. Right? Thanks, guys.